Welcome back to another ACRP TV Spotlight. Today we're looking at clinical trial ethics in 2021 here at the very end of 2020, and we've got the right person to talk to about this. Jennifer Goldsack is the Executive Director at the Digital Medicine Society. Jennifer, thanks for joining us today.
Of course, pleasure to be here.
All right, let's talk ethics. I mean, COVID has changed. You can talk more about what it has changed and what it hasn't changed with trials. The landscape's different. Decentralized trials and hybrid trials are on the rise. They're great in a lot of ways, but they raise some new issues. So I thought what we could do is maybe break this in two parts roughly, talk about maybe ethically some evergreen issues that haven't changed because of everything that's going on, and maybe a few ethical issues that are rearing their head, for want of a better term, or maybe things that are sneaking up on us. So with that as a sort of a backdrop, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Michael, that's a great question. I think that COVID-19 and the public health crisis that we've all faced around the world has done a couple of things. First of all, it has absolutely expedited our movement towards taking more decentralized approaches to the way we conduct clinical trials, bringing them to the patient instead of forcing the patient or the participant to come to the clinic. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. I think the other thing that's really important that we have to recognize that COVID has done is it's shone a light on the astonishing health inequities that we face. We've seen a hugely disparate impact of the disease, whether it's incidence, whether it's death rates among different communities, not just here in the US, but around the world. And I think it's reminded us that we have to do a better job at ensuring that the way we do not only healthcare delivery, but also health research and clinical trials better reflects the entire population that it's our duty to solve. So I think there's a couple of things here on deck. But let's talk specifically about sort of decentralized trials. To me, and there's a lot of words that people use, Michael, people talk about decentralized clinical trials, or maybe it's not fully decentralized, maybe it's hybrid. I don't care. I get frustrated sometimes with the language. And, you know, it's important that we have a common language. But to me, the movement is less about moving towards decentralization on the spectrum and much more about moving to the participant, moving to the patient and taking elements of the trial to them, whether it's trying to develop new medical products that better address their needs, whether it's to reducing the burden on them participating so that we can make it easier for everyone to participate and thus get a more generalizable sample. And thus sort of when effective medical products come through, we know how to deploy them safely, effectively, ethically, equitably in the real world. That's what this movement is about to me. It's about using a whole new armory, whether that's a virtual visit, whether that's remote monitoring, whether it's leveraging local clinics, local labs, local imaging centers, visiting nurses, whatever that right combination of tools is for the patient population, for the protocol, for the investigational medical product. It's about building it around the patient to get the best information as quickly as we can. I don't care if we call it decentralized or not. And I think there's been a real movement in this direction as a consequence of what we've all lived through in 2020.
A bit of a potato thing going on here. Somewhere.
Exactly.
We don't want to call the whole thing off. So let's talk about the ethical issues though, because, you know, the way I'm looking at it, and I'm being rather simplistic here, but it's the end of the year, it's the beginning of the year, it's a time to kind of reflect and look. And I guess fundamentally, I'm curious what you think about ethically with trials, some of the things that have changed or going to change because of this, and some of the things that won't.
I think the area that I focus on most, Michael, is around the use of digital technologies. And I don't want to sort of, I'm certainly not an ethicist, but I think constantly about the ethical implications of using these technologies. I think about the promise of using these tools to engage hard to reach participants in clinical trials, to reduce burden of participation. You don't have to come to the trial site every time. We can, there's a whole array of ways we can use these tools to better build the trial around the participant. But we have to be cognizant of potential blind spots, whether that's something as simple as, does the technology itself, let's say we're using it for heart rate monitoring, right? Something that we all understand, many of us who wear a smartwatch can see the green light. Is that performing as well for participants of all different skin tones. We have to be thinking to ask that question. If we want to start using things like AI to mine large data sets that no longer live in manila folders, but now are accessible because they're digital, are we baking in bias in our outreach because we haven't thought about it as we've developed the test data set and as we've trained those algorithms? Are we disproportionately excluding people who are less tech literate, right? There's all of these new ways, but one thing I think is really important. I hear a lot of people grabbing onto these issues, and they're certainly important, but what I would remind us all, how representative samples or patient populations are in our trials today is very, very poor. Current state is not good. And so I think there's a real balance here where we need to be thoughtful, we need to be intentional around how we deploy these new technologies, these new methodologies, decentralized trials. But I also think we mustn't hamstring ourselves by refusing to move forward, refusing to make progress because we are waiting for utopia. Current state is pretty bad. 1 in 5 trials shut down because we can't recruit enough patients, and those molecules go back on the shelf. The representation in current clinical trials is very poor. So that's not to beat up on current state. That's just the situation we're in. And I think we need to be intentional around how we use this new toolbox of digital products and some of those other methodologies like local clinics to really make a difference across the board. And if we can see step after step after step of incremental improvement, I would be happy.
And as you just said a moment ago, I mean, none of us are, or I'm not sure how many, I'm not even sure what a professional ethicist is, but, we're not professional, we're not, a lot of us are just philosophy majors or something, but we do have to be aware of these ethical issues you're raising. And a lot of it's common sense, but, it's not always so common, or there are things you just wouldn't think of unless you sit down and make yourself really think it through, which I think is some of what you're talking about. It's the technologies, but it's the thought process behind it.
That's exactly right. And certainly professional ethicists do exist and they're brilliant, but we can't say that it's their purview only. We all need to take responsibility for this. And the word that I like, Michael, is intentional. We have to be thoughtful. We cannot forge ahead blindly, deploying these things because they're shiny, because they're cool, and or because we're in a tight spot, because COVID has put this entire industry in crisis mode. We can't just throw things at the problem. There is this whole new toolbox. Many of them are high quality, evidence-based. There are thoughtful ways that we can not only maintain the status quo in terms of equity, but we can improve it. But it requires us being intentional and it requires us being mindful. Now, I say all of that, a lot of people listening will hear, crikey, that's just going to slow us down. And I think there's a false dichotomy too around being intentional, around being thoughtful, and around being slow. No one's saying we need to slow the pace of innovation, but let's just be mindful. Let's be intentional as we make these changes. Let's make changes we can all be proud of. Let's make changes that really positively affect our industry in every way, not just timelines and milestones, but also in terms of equity, also in terms of quality of information, and also in terms of the way that we serve participants.
Well, I think mindful might be a really good watchword for 2021. So you've gotten us off to a good start. Really appreciate it. This has been ACRP TV Spotlight on Clinical Trial Ethics in 2021. We've been speaking with Jennifer Goldsack, who's the Executive Director at the Digital Medicine Society. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It was my pleasure.